Well, hello. I am Dr. Anthony Edwards, and I'm the instructor for higher education leadership. And today we're going to be talking about crisis leadership. So, what are we going to go over today? Well, I'm glad you asked. We're going to talk about the differences between crisis management and crisis leadership, definitions of a crisis, stages of a crisis, different taxonomies or types of crises, examples of higher education crises from the news, crisis leadership behaviors, the crisis leadership continuum, the crisis leadership practical process model, crisis prevention considerations, the crisis communication questions, and crisis communication tips, communication principles, and strategies for managing organizational change during a crisis, communication response strategies model, and crisis leadership principles. So, what's the difference between crisis management and crisis leadership? Well, crisis management tends to be reactive and tactical, whereas crisis leadership tends to be more strategic, systematic, proactive. Okay? So, when you're just dealing with things in the moment, more management. If you're being proactive and thinking about how you can prevent things and execute when you've already got that plan in place, that's more leadership. So, what are some different ways you can define a crisis? One is as a disruption. Okay. You could also look at it as a turning point, where things change. You can also look at it as a challenging opportunity. And you could look at it as a difficult situation or dilemma. So, it depends on, and we'll get to this later, but are you seizing the opportunity in the crisis? And you don't want the crisis to happen, but is there an opportunity to do something great? So when we think about crises, and these could be higher education crises or really any kind of crisis. So we have a few different authors who've created models with different stages. So Mitroff in 1994 created a model that has 5 stages. And the first stage is signal detection, which is essentially figuring out that there might be something that could go wrong. Then there's a stage of proving and prevention. So it's kind of saying, yes, something really could go wrong, and gathering some evidence that something could go wrong and then trying to prevent it. When something does happen, you have to contain the damage, right? Minimize, contain the damage. Then there's a recovery phase, and then there's some organizational learning, figuring out what we could have done differently. Okay. All right. So Coombs, which we'll see a lot in this chapter, 2015, came out with his stages, and we have pre-crisis, crisis event, and post-crisis. So that's a lot simpler. So there's what happens before the crisis, what happens during the crisis, and what happens after. Okay. All right, let's talk about taxonomies. And here we're talking about types of crises. So Lurbinger describes crises in a few different types. One is a natural crisis, so maybe there's a hurricane, earthquake, so fire. Technological, okay, does the student information system go down? Skewed management values, maybe there's starting to put a value on enrolling people by any means necessary to meet financial needs. Confrontation, maybe there's a crisis where maybe there's a student group on campus who's protesting and says they're going to go and take over the student union building. Doesn't happen much these days, but used to happen. Those things used to happen a lot back in the day. Malevolence, so someone is intentionally doing some bad things to defraud the institution or to hurt other people. I think of some people who are involved in financial aid scandals and stealing money from students. They were intentionally doing that. And then there's deception. So maybe there's and it could be combined with malevolence, but there's an attempt to deceive people, to get people to do things um, without necessarily understanding all the information, or to withhold information, get people to make decisions without good information. Management misconduct. So this kind of goes with skewed management values, but then there's actually management making decisions that are inappropriate and taking action. Um, and then there's business and economics. So maybe the economy changed, and it could be a situation where the economy is so good nobody wants to go to school, and then you have crisis of enrollment, or there's a stock market crash, or the economy tanks and nobody has any money for tuition. So can be any number of situations. All right, so that's Lerbinger's group of taxonomies. So what about Myers and Alusha? So you have crisis of public perception. So right now, higher ed is dealing definitely with the crisis of public perception on the value, and not feeling like college is worth it. Sudden market shifts. So again, typically when the economy is good, people, particularly with adult students, when the economy is good, they just work, and when the economy is bad, they either because they're worried about a potential layoff or other issues, they decide, I might need to go back and retool my skills and go back to school. And this is really, a lot of these are more business oriented, like product failure. So if you have a business, obviously you had a product and it didn't work, that could be a crisis. And higher ed, if you're not able to deliver classes, that might be considered product failure. Management succession. So you have leadership that moves on, and the people who are there are not in place to be able to handle the things that person did when they leave. So, I think about, roles, that I've been in where, you have to train the next person who's going to come after that person. And that person is new to that role and needs someone to mentor them before the other person leaves. All right. So cash crises. So, maybe not meeting enrollment goals. So you don't have the cash that you need. You're not meeting fundraising goals. So those can be crises. Industrial relations crisis. That's more of a business one. But we do have cases in higher ed where graduate students are trying to unionize in some places. You have issues where faculty and staff have issues with employee satisfaction. So those would be industrial relations crises in higher ed. Hostile takeovers, you don't really see that so much in higher ed, but you do see some mergers. We are seeing some institutions. We've seen some institutions in Texas join university systems that were independent originally. So there's been a movement toward that. In other states, we're starting to see community colleges and universities joining the same systems, because their funding model is a little different than the way we do things in Texas. Ours in Texas is a little more local funding model, whereas other states have more of a state funding model. But y'all will learn more about that in higher ed finance. Adverse international events. So in that higher ed, what comes to mind is COVID. So when COVID hit, what we a lot of times think about is campuses shut down. But also think about countries were locked down, so there wasn't travel in and out. So if you were an international student and you planned to come to the United States to study, and the United States was no longer accepting people from that location, you couldn't come. And so that could be an adverse international event, because we would be depending on that enrollment. And generally speaking, most of our international students are they intend to study face to face at the campus and not online from their home. So that could be an issue. Regulation, deregulation. So higher ed's going through a huge deregulation change. The last legislative session, the way community colleges were funding changed, and so that's going to create a ripple of effects throughout community colleges, and then eventually some of those changes may show up on the university level. So lots of potential crises. All right, so Coombs has some types of disasters that Coombs describes. So we have, again, natural disasters, fire, hurricane, storm, etc. Malevolence, again, we talked about that already. Workplace violence. We've seen situations, like what happened at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, with a graduate student allegedly going after a faculty member. So there are certain situations where that can happen. Technical breakdown. So if you have the learning management system at the beginning of the school year, and somehow it's no longer functional, and students can't get into it, and faculty can't get into it, that's a crisis. And this has happened at an institution in Texas in the last few weeks. So human breakdown. So again, we're not talking technology, we're talking people. So maybe people messed up. So maybe there were processes in place and people didn't follow those processes. People didn't sign the forms they were supposed to sign on time. And therefore, people weren't able to register or do things they needed to do. Rumors. I don't know if there's a university or a community college out there that doesn't have any rumors, but these rumors, if people think so-and-so is going to leave the institution, or if something bad happened at the institution, those can be crises because they can affect public perception. They could affect enrollment. They could affect funding. You think about there's schools that are shutting down, and a lot of times there's rumors that finances may be bad at an institution, but they might not be so bad that you're going to shut down. But these rumors, because you're seeing other schools close, could make people worried if their school is next. Organizational misdeeds. So again, kind of goes back to the malevolence, but if there are bad decisions that are being made on behalf of the institution. Mitroff, in this case, partnered with Anagnos, and they describe crises in these categories. So there's, again, economic, so the economy changes, and people can, maybe can't come back to school. If you think about political, in the sense of, if you think about war times, when you had, the world wars, or the draft with Vietnam, and people had to go to war and couldn't go to college at that time. That certainly affected enrollment. Informational. So if information about the institution is out there and it's not good, that could be a crisis. That could affect, as we say later on here, reputation. Again, we have certain institutions around the country right now that are embroiled in athletic scandals, and those things can affect the reputation of the institution. And in some of those cases, you have new leaders that are those, and some were there when those things happened, some were not there when those things happened, but they're having to deal with them and trying to be accountable for those decisions, even though they weren't there when those decisions happened. Human resources issues. So a lot of institutions are dealing with financial issues, and so there are layoffs, and that can be a crisis, because when people start seeing exodus of folks out of the institution that can again lead to rumors or other things. And it can affect perception, reputation. Again, another issue, reputation. We've got issues, like with another example, West Virginia University right now is dealing with some reputation issues because they're having to close some programs due to low enrollment. And, there's some issues there that, a lot of people are upset about those programs being closed and the impact on the institution's reputation. So those things are real, and they are happening around us. Psychopathic acts, and I think kind of goes back to Coombs and talking about workplace violence, but again, we do have issues of mental illness on campuses, and as we'll talk about some issues that have happened at different institutions, that can be an issue where a person can hurt a lot of people. Physical loss. So that could be power plants, other facilities. So it could be buildings. I think about a few years ago at Tarleton State University, there was a bad storm, and we had a lot of trees that came down, a lot of wind damage, and some buildings were, particularly I think in the with the agriculture program, some buildings were severely damaged and had to be essentially kind of redone. And so those kind of things can happen. And there's, if you have students that are having to work in those programs or other responsibilities, that is a crisis. It may not be a whole institution crisis, but it could be a crisis for that college or that department. All right. Coombs also kind of breaks down crises into three categories here. We'll deal with the first two on this slide. The first category is vision crises. And in this case, there's not a lot of responsibility on the part of the institution, or in this case, when I say responsibility, meaning they're at fault. Obviously, the institution is not at fault for a natural disaster. The institution can't always control rumors being spread. You can't necessarily control what people say. If there's an active shooter situation, you can't control some of those things. You can provide training for how to spot folks that might be stressed out and might be escalating, but you can't necessarily prevent it 100% of the time because of things that individual is dealing with. Again, product tampering is more of a business model, but obviously there could be issues where, again, like let's just say you're delivering courses and someone decides to hack into the system, even though you've got security measures in place, and prevent people from being able to access their courses or being able to communicate with their advisor, locking down emails, so things like that. It's not always the institution's fault on those types of things. You also have accident crises, so there is some fault or responsibility of the institution, but not a high level of accountability or fault there. And so different challenges that happen. Obviously, it could be economic, could be again any number of things that you could lump in the challenges category. It could be technical error things. So the computer system could just there could be a coding issue and it doesn't work. There could be we have a lot of systems where they're cloud based, and so maybe something happens. The system it manages the program is actually based in Florida. In Florida, maybe it gets hit with a hurricane and knocks out the power at place where some of the data is stored, and we don't have access to the data for some period in time if there's not any redundancy. You can argue there's a natural disaster piece there, but Again, it could be, just it could be coding issues. All right. And again, the product harm is more of a business analogy, but I kind of lump both the technical error pieces together. Okay, the last category for Coombs is preventable crises. So here there is a strong level of responsibility, accountability on the part of the organization, institution, etc. Because again, these are preventable. So human error accidents. So there are things you can do when it's human error to prevent human error. You can have processes, procedures, checks and balances, uh, to make sure that certain things don't happen. You think about data being shared that maybe they're personally identifiable information that's shared that shouldn't be shared. There usually is a way to prevent that from happening. And again, it could be organizational. So, there might be, again, if you notice that, certain things aren't looking right, that, you take necessary action to correct it before it becomes an even larger problem because, someone that, steals from financial aid and takes, $100 here and there may decide, well, maybe I'll take $1,000 here and there, and it can escalate when you don't take care of those things and prevent them when they're small. So, all right. So we talked about generic taxonomies. Let's talk about some crises that can happen specifically in the field of higher education. Obviously, you can have academic taxonomies, so you can have issue, a program shutting down. It can be academic, athletics. Again, we're seeing a lot of athletic scandals happening at institutions. Making sure that folks are compliant with NCAA regulations. Could be some institutions that have clinical facilities. There could be a clinical issue with medical errors or some sort of whether intentional or non-intentional issues with folks on clinical trials and side effects or things like that. The facilities or technological issues, so whether it's the physical plant or IT systems, software, hardware, etc. Financial issues, so again, budget, not meeting budget expectations for revenue, having higher expenditures than are necessary, not following rules for expenses, human resources issues. So again, we go through a lot of human resources training on what's acceptable behavior in the workplace, and but you could still have someone who engages in inappropriate behavior toward other people. Issues of leadership. There could be a person who is in a leadership position who doesn't lead effectively. We think about leaders, whether they're presidents of countries or presidents of universities or businesses, but crises are going to come, and so it just someone may shrink back and not know what the right thing to do is, or they may be reactionary, but maybe they help the institution to grow, succeed in that situation, or the institution shrinks back and never really recovers from the issue, or the culture of the institution is damaged. Again, natural disasters do impact institutions. Obviously, you have to think about hurricanes that can affect whether or not classes are going on. Public safety. I think about you have places where, like, if you think Flint, Michigan, other places where you've got water issues and not access to clean water. There are colleges in those towns, and so those college students don't have faculty, staff don't have access to clean water, and that impacts their safety on campus. Obviously we think about the active shooter situation, but there's all kinds of public safety issues. Uh, you know, so student affairs issues, whether it's hazing or you have. We'll talk about a big one in a minute, but just making sure that students manage the finances of the organization correctly. I mean, there's student employees. There's all kinds of issues there. All right, so let's talk about issues in the news. So, my alma mater is Texas A&M. I graduated in 2000, so it's been a little while since then. But that gives me a good vantage point to talk about this next topic because I was a student there in the fall of 1999. And I remember getting a call asking me if I was okay, and then turning on the news and realizing that something really, really bad had just happened. And that was the collapse of the bonfire, and what they constructed, or what they were constructing. But the institution has been heralded as a great example of how to handle a crisis, because they had to quickly investigate to find out what happened, what went wrong, and figure out why, and make recommendations for what was or was not going to happen in the future. And they had to make an unpopular decision about the future of the bonfire, even though, again, it was a very popular event, but they had to focus on student and public safety. So that's definitely one issue. Recently, you had the active shooter at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Had another one in Florida at Edward Waters University not too long ago. So Michigan State's dealt with a lot of athletic issues, whether it's coaches or whether there's allegations there, and so whether it's coaches, whether it's trainers, etc. But a lot of issues there in terms of allegations of misconduct. Baylor University, again, has dealt with athletics issues. Had coaches that have been disciplined over that. Stanford had their president who had to resign. Student there at the student newspaper did some digging on the person's writing and discovered there could be some instances of plagiarism, and so the president felt like it was in the best interest of him and the institution to resign. So lots of different crises in the news. These are just a handful. All right, so let's talk about some behaviors associated with crisis leadership. So you're going to be a leader, so you're going to have to deal with some crises if you stay in leadership long enough. So first tip that DeBrin offers is to remain calm. Then make sure you're preparing before the crisis occurs as well as during the crisis. So if you're preparing before, you might have some processes in place to help you when you get there. Utilizing your team members' strengths. Don't try to do everything yourself. And don't forget that there are a lot of people with skills on your team that can help you figure out what's the next thing to do and take care of a lot of things for you. And also resist temptation to stonewall and try to pretend like nothing's wrong. If there's something wrong, let's get it out in the open and deal with it. And don't pretend like it's not there, because you can actually prolong the problem. And also erode trust of the institution with internal stakeholders as well as external stakeholders. Then start to reestablish your work process, schedules, and routines. So I think about with COVID, a lot of institutions were, some institutions waited a long time to return to campus. Others came back earlier. Others, waited a long time before offering classes online. Others started doing those things earlier. Also, some, started figuring out how to offer a lot of their services virtually. Um, whether it's student life or student services, but just getting back into those work routines, because the longer you sit, it kind of doesn't help you in terms of getting through the crisis. Being transformational, not transactional. You know, in using not just charisma, but using hope to motivate people, encouraging people, talking about the vision, talking about recognizing, again, the next step, accomplishments and milestones. Recognize your team members, show what's happening that's helping, and just really showcase examples. And then don't waste a crisis. Uh, Crisis provides an opportunity, and you can either just kind of go through the motions and try to get through it, or you can try to find the opportunity that's there to maybe move your institution to a new level. Maybe there's, the fact that you had this crisis of, so say there was an employee that engaged in misconduct. Maybe that's an opportunity for your institution to then lead the discussion on how to excel in that area, and make some changes to your policies and procedures to prevent this from ever happening and again in the future. So just look for the opportunity to build on it. So, and you may discover, hey, the fact that we had a lack of security in this area is recognized, that we've now have state-of-the-art security in all of our buildings, and we've got to build new buildings with security in mind, and that could become a call to fundraise. And so, you've got to figure out where's the opportunity. All right, so Muffett, Willett, and Cruz provided the crisis leadership continuum, and so I've got normal situations here on the left and crisis situations on the right, but kind of keep in mind that that it's a continuum, so it's not just extremes. There's some places in the middle. All right, so in the normal situations, you just have routine decision making. It's non-threatening, it's familiar, everything's moving as it normally does. Then you get to the crisis on the other end. You have this severe threat to the visibility of the organization and viability of the organization. You have complex and decision making that's needed, and the decisions are not routine. Okay, so you got to figure out what to do in this new situation, because it's a different set of circumstances. And some crises are super severe, others may be less severe, and so that's why we say it's a continuum. So specific to higher ed, Muffett Willett also has the Higher Ed Crisis Leadership Practical Process Model. So here, kind of first component of that is support and involvement from your top administration. So the senior leadership has to be visible and present in kind of helping the organization get through the process. So again, not getting into politics. I'm just giving you an example here. So if you think about in previous presidential administration, we had to deal with COVID. And so in that time period, there was a lot of information that the government had to help and reassure people and get people back to everyday living. And there were regular reports on a daily basis, and you'd see different secretaries of different parts of the administration come on and make reports about what was happening, whether it was commerce or public health or small business administration. And so, but you got to see all of these different top administrative leaders being involved. And so, again, not an endorsement of one style of leadership or another, or political ideology. I'm just showing that as an example of top administrative support. Uh, Training accountability, and also mandating a structure around the accountability for training. So there are going to be folks who aren't prepared for what has to happen to deal with the crisis. And so you're going to have to train them, and you're also going to have to deal with the long-term issues that expose areas that were training gaps. And those things, essentially have to be mandated, that there's a process and structure for providing the training. Gathering baseline information. So you can't necessarily operate if you don't have the information. You got to do the best you have at the time, but you have to gather some information. And you got to see how this crisis is different from others, or different from your status quo, your normal situation. Also, you got to get people involved, particularly those who are motivated. So you may move down out of just senior leadership, but getting middle level leaders involved as well, and then allowing them to have some ownership over the process, and really getting a sense for how the training is going and getting their voices heard. Also, and this is again, a lot of this is around the training that's needed in crisis, but designing the training around different kinds of crises. All right, so not every crisis is going to be the same, but dealing with the areas of concern that the participants have, and making sure that they're ready to deal with the crisis that could come. So again, some part of this is like dealing with the crisis that is happening, but it's also crisis prevention and figuring out, again, because we said crisis leadership is strategic, right, and systematic. We're not just dealing with it as it comes. We're trying to prepare for different kinds of crises before they occur. So some different considerations that you should think about in preventing crises include the following. So what types of situations is your unit, department, institution the most vulnerable in? So we like to focus on where we're strong, but where are we weak? Where do we have some vulnerabilities as an institution? We don't like to think about it, but the problem with that is people will exploit those weaknesses. All right, so depending on those different vulnerabilities, so which internal and stakeholders are going to be most at risk? So are there particular residence halls that are not as secure as others? And are those students who live in those residence halls at more risk? Are there electrical issues that need to be repaired? Things like that in certain buildings. Are the faculty and staff who work in those buildings more at risk than others? So who needs to be engaged in that crisis response process? So, does university marketing need to be involved? Does student engagement need to be involved? Does faculty affairs need to be involved? Who needs to be involved in responding to the crisis? Does enrollment management need to get involved? Do you need to get involved? Student counseling services. To deal with people dealing with, I think about, students that are dealing with, students that, maybe, we have students that at a nearby institution, this, student lost their life, and other students probably know that student and are dealing with the mental anguish over that. We've got, again, active shooter situations where maybe they weren't injured by that person, but the fact that there was an active shooter on campus stresses them out, and every day they're worried about another event, and they need to see a counselor about it. So, those are things you need to think about. What kind of communication do you need to use, and to what people, and through which delivery method? All right, so again, to kind of borrow the analogy before, you're going to use the waves approach. So you're probably going to need to do some in-person events, some one-on-ones, some town halls, go to some committee meetings, but you probably will probably need to. You may need to communicate with media. You may need to communicate um, through video, through email. So there might be a variety of methods. Social media, might be a lot of different ways to communicate. Uh, so the goal here is to try to prevent these events from getting to a level of a crisis. So you can't always commit or can always prevent things from happening, but maybe you prevent them from not rising to a crisis level. So you may not necessarily be able to prevent an active shooter situation on your campus, but you probably there might be some things you could do to minimize their potential to hurt people. Um, so think about that before, during, and after the crisis situation. All right, so some general questions to think about with crisis communication, what you're trying to convey to. So think about the person that's got to communicate with the media or using university or college media to communicate. You're going to want to state clearly what happened. You're going to want to convey, is this something that could happen again or expand or get worse? Also, what tangible actions is the institution taking to prevent this crisis from happening again? So, keep it simple. Probably not best to stray into a lot of detail, but those are the types of things that people are going to be most interested in knowing. So Coombs again has some tips for crisis communication. So be quick. Don't take too long to communicate. Don't wait. Be consistent. Don't be super excited one day and really reserve the next day. Try to be consistent. If you're going to also be consistent, if you're going to communicate regularly, maybe it's a press conference every day for the first 2 or 3 days at the same time, or emails that come out. If there's a regular email cadence, think about those types of things. Be open. All right, so collaborative, transparent. There may be things you can't share, but share what you can. But people will know if you're hiding things from them. And people will know also if there are things you can't share. If you just, if you're honest with people of things you can and can't share for different reasons. But generally, be open in terms of the way you communicate. All right, so Benoit Pang's strategies for managing organizational image during your crisis will include things like denial, Again, this is not saying these are all preferred. These are just different ways you could do it. You can deny that something's an issue. You could evade responsibility, say it's not really your fault. You could try to minimize how offensive the act is and say, well, maybe, well, yeah, it happened, but it's really not that bad, and here's why. You could take some sort of corrective action against what's happened, and you could also accept responsibility for what happened and apologize for it. So those are what different ways that you can manage your image as an institution. And we've seen leaders do all of these things. So you can think of, again, you can go into other industries, other fields, and see where these things are happening, but they also happen in higher ed. All right, so Coombs kind of also looks at some of these different strategies in building a communication response strategies model, and the author kind of clumps these together in terms of levels of acceptance. So people are generally not very interested in communication that involves denial and also attacking the accuser. So you see this a lot in politics, where someone will say something about someone, and rather than deal with it, they'll just say, well, no, that person really is a bad person, so you shouldn't listen to anything they have to say. So people really aren't interested in that. There's some level of acceptance for when the organization talks about the things that they have done that are good. Some level of acceptance for kind of minimizing the how bad the damage was, and also some mild acceptance of denying that that's what they didn't, that they intended for these things to happen. That they happened, but that's not what we intended. You see that a lot of times today in public apologies, like, well, I'm sorry that you were offended by this comment. That wasn't my intent. And I would argue a lot of people are like, well, if you're not apologizing for offending someone, why bother apologizing? So that's one of those things that happens. But there's a higher level of acceptance for taking corrective action, trying to fix things, and a very high level of acceptance for giving a full apology for what happened and taking ownership of it. So here's a higher ed leadership example. So you have the president of Tulane University, which is in New Orleans, and this person was president during Hurricane Katrina and is providing some principles of crisis leadership. So those include doing the right thing, seeking common ground or consensus, gathering facts and information, understanding the reality of what's happening. If you're not being realistic or not acknowledging what's happening, you can't really deal with it effectively. Standing up for your beliefs and core principles, making contact with folks, so not just acting independently, but actually actively seeking out folks. All right, innovating. So sometimes crisis provides an opportunity to do something you've never done before, or apply something in one situation that has been traditionally used somewhere else. So because of necessity, there might be a need to do something innovative. Embrace your emotion. Sometimes there's a tendency as a leader to want to be stoic, but people also want to know that you're human and that what happened bothers you, and that can again build trust and help people in terms of being a transformational leader and wanting to do more than the minimum. All right, again, being true to the core values. Again, it kind of comes back to standing up for your beliefs, but just figuring out how are you going to, think about those people, in New Orleans, whether it was Tulane or Dillard or University of New Orleans, they had to figure out how to help their students. So even though They may not have been able to offer classes for a while, or they may not have been able to deal with the flooding. They had students who needed help, and even after the hurricane, you have students that are coming back, and for the institution it might be business as usual, but for those students, they may have lingering issues, or have had lingering issues that they needed help with. And as core value of the institution, if they're core values around things like service and support, figuring out what those students need is an example of that. All right, so what did we discuss today? Well, we talked about the difference between crisis leadership and crisis management, definitions of a crisis, stages of a crisis, the taxonomies of crises, examples from the news of higher education crises, behaviors associated with crisis leadership, and the crisis leadership continuum, the crisis leadership practical process model, considerations for crisis prevention, questions for crisis communication and tips for crisis communication, communication principles, strategies for managing organizational image during a crisis, communication response strategies model, and crisis leadership principles. So I hope you enjoy this video. I hope it helps you better understand crisis leadership and how to handle a crisis. So if you enjoy this video, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video. Thanks. Bye.